Okay. All right. Yay. Welcome, Erin and Mike from Pomegranate Coaching and Mediation. We're going to talk about conflict today. And I feel like this started because I posted something on social. I don't even remember what, but you responded, Erin. And I think the gist of it was like, oh, people are very conflict avoidant, but it's actually something that we can't avoid. So how do we engage in it in a generative and skillful way? So
Yeah,
before we get into the conversation, if you want to introduce yourself, and Mike, introduce yourself and introduce your business, that would be great. And then we can kind of get into it.
great. My name's Erin, and along with my partner, Mike, we run Pomegranate Coaching and Mediation. And our work kind of has three pillars. We do individual coaching, we do mediation services when people have a specific conflict that they need support moving through with a neutral professional. And then we also do group coaching and educational experiences around the topics of conflict, communication, and just relational health in general.
And a lot of what we do is really focus on helping people figure out what their values and guiding principles are so that we have an approach focus rather than outcome focus on conflict. Because when you're in conflict, you don't have control over how the other person is approaching it, but you can feel like you're in your integrity if you're staying in touch with your values. So that's really the thing that we focus on across all three of those pillars.
Okay, nice. Yeah, so let's just jump into it. Let's talk conflict. I mean, I guess we should start with like, why do people avoid conflict? Like, or why do we think that conflict is bad to have and that like a good relationship is conflict free?
Yeah.
That's such a good question.
Yeah.
And we're laughing at each other because we have both encountered plenty of conflict avoidance personally and with clients. And I think the simple answer is that conflict is hard and uncomfortable. And what part of what we try to do is actually normalize conflict and help people feel less guilty about the fact that they're having conflict. And really, the analogy that I've been using recently is learning how to do conflict is like learning how to ride a bike. If no one teaches you how to do it, it feels uncomfortable. You feel wobbly, you feel shaky, you're not sure how to approach things. If someone's there to give you some tools and some advice of here's how this can go more smoothly, then you start to feel centered and grounded and you can do it. But it's natural for conflict to feel yucky because we teach people how to ride bikes, but we don't really teach people how to do conflict.
Hmm.
I think too, something I've been thinking about a lot lately, kind of especially through the lens of like restorative justice, is that the presence of conflict simply means the presence of difference. And that's actually something that we want more of in our lives. And we want to kind of create ways of inviting more of it rather than less. And so to me, like things like justice work, things like relational work require an inviting of conflict, not in ways that are like, I always want to be fighting or I'm a fire sign, so that's just how I have to approach my world or whatever. But inviting a process where we can be in difference with each other and still not lose integrity, still not lose mutual respect, still not lose the like imagined future that we might be able to build together. It's really important to have a process that embraces difference so that collaboration can happen.
Well, I promised you we'd stick to our questions, and I already kind of want to go into the weeds because I want to talk about this like difference being okay. And the last thing that you just said, like what do we do in order to make that happen? Like, what are some skills or some like reframes that we need? Because I totally agree with you. I mean, I do a lot of identity work with my client, and it does seem like the more that you come into the wholeness of who you are, the more, of course, there's going to be difference with other people. Everyone is like one of a kind, and the fuller we are in that. So how do we navigate that without just being a total hermit and not having any relationships?
Yeah. I mean, Mike, if I can go off of your
course, yeah.
guiding principles thing, that to me is so much of it, because you know, if for Mike and I, like, we have a few guiding principles that are actually like the ones that we've established between the two of us. And so if we're in conflict, which we do get into even as conflict coaches, we no longer have to arrive at a point of like, okay, we agree 100% on our approach, or, you know, our next decision or whatever it is. But what we do want to come back to every time is this honoring our guiding principles of accountability, autonomy, vulnerability, things like that. So that even if we're not quite in agreement about, okay, where are we heading next, or what are we deciding next, kind of the underlying feeling is what matters more there. Like, do we feel like there's significant trust? Do we feel like we're both in integrity around the things that we say matter to us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just add to that. I think as far as how do we not hermit, how do we, you know, Erin mentioned imagined futures. Yeah, when you get into conflict with someone, it can feel scary, and sometimes conflict is high stakes depending on the content of the conflict. But this idea of, is this person communicating, first of all, are they identifying their values? Are they taking the time to think about how they want to show up in relationship in the world? And then are they communicating those clearly and transparently? And then if they've done those two things, when I'm in conflict with someone, I might have difference or disagreement. But if I look at that person and say, they are in integrity with how they said they want to show up, we're disagreeing about the content, I think it makes it easier to not spiral into a sense where you are in conflict and you're looking at the other person as the problem. A lot of what we do in mediation is try and get people dislodged from looking at the other party in conflict as the source of the conflict. The conflict is actually external to the two people. And if you can assess people based on how they're approaching that conflict, now you can collaborate even if you disagree. Mm-hmm. And then you can imagine those futures potentially differently. Maybe it didn't look the way that you thought, but you can continue along the path of being able to be together in difference. Yeah. It can feel sticky, and it doesn't always feel great, but that is kind of the price of being in community and inviting difference into your life and not being a hermit. Mm-hmm. is when we talk a lot about being able to sit in discomfort, that's a skill that requires knowing yourself. If you know yourself, you're better able to sit in discomfort with someone else, I think.
Yeah. And Celestyna, you said something that really like sparked something in my brain, which is that a lot of times people have this idea that just the presence of conflict alone is an indicator that a relationship isn't going well. And actually, like, we just take conflict as a given. Even in nature, there's conflict all the time. You know, things are competing for resources or whatever, you know, whatever it is. But it's really how the conflict is or is not addressed that can indicate whether there's a healthy relationship or not.
Yeah. Well, okay, so this is interesting because I do feel like these days, if there's like stickiness or discomfort, especially like ongoing discomfort or stickiness in a relationship, I think people tend to take that as a sign that like, oh, we're not right for each other. We're not meant to be together. Like, let's just break up. And then like go find someone else. And then like the cycle repeats. And also I am thinking of like, there might be times where, and it is a discernment thing. So that's where this question is going. There might be times where like maybe the difference is too much. And maybe it really is like a relationship that should not continue, or it just really takes too much effort for each person to be in the relationship in a sustainable way.
Absolutely.
So how do people know where they land on that spectrum? Like, is it like, oh, I need to grow my tolerance for discomfort? Or is it like, oh no, actually, this is too much discomfort? Like genuinely.
I think not to drill in on the same point, but the nuanced part of the patterns for me is thinking about why you're fighting is important as opposed to what you're fighting about. I think a lot of people get stuck in a relationship on, we joke about like you could go out Family Feud style and ask people what they're fighting about, and you'd have a lot of overlap as far as the content of what people are fighting about. But the folks who are able to move through conflict rather than get stuck in it and say, as you mentioned, Celestyna, well, this relationship just isn't right. I just need to meet someone who agrees with all of my opinions on money, sex, chores, raising kids, religion, et cetera, et cetera. Like, you can try and find that AI generated person, or you can think about your approach. And a lot of our work is informed by tenets of nonviolent communication. And one of the biggest things there is thinking about what are the unmet needs that are leading to the feelings that are leading to the fights. And if you're able to think about what your own unmet needs are and have the empathy to ask the other person what their unmet needs are, now you can actually uncover what the issues are rather than your positions. People tend to fight about positions instead of what the actual issues are and the unmet needs. So it's very possible that a lot of people don't necessarily know what their values are, or they think they do, but they use words like respect and accountability. And then if you ask them, what does respect mean to you? The glazed eyes happen of like, I've never thought about actually defining what respect is or how it feels. And honestly, part of our work is helping people dial in on those things. And sometimes that does mean that if you've never done that before, Erin might figure out specifically what her values are, and I figure out specifically what my values are. And we realize that there's not enough overlap to move forward. And at that point, the relationship can end, it can transition, it can de-escalate. But if you're not, it's like looking through frosted glass if you haven't done that. Mm-hmm. And you kind of need to wipe away the soap wash on the glass to see clearly what is it that is really important to me, to be able to assess whether that relationship is where you can be in integrity in your values or not. Yeah. And either one is fine as long as you're, I think, approaching it in that way and being able to speak to your values.
Yeah, I'm going to say, like, if we're talking kind of red flags, if you, like, I'll speaking for myself, and in past relationships, I would realize in moments of conflict, like, oh, it's actually not possible for me to show up and engage in an approach to this conflict where honesty is a given, right? Or where mutual respect is a given. And I just started to see, like, okay, I have all these tools, but no matter how I'm showing up, honesty with this particular person apparently is not a shared value. And so I actually can't even really show up as myself because it's just kind of a closed door at that point. Like, I don't really know what to do, So I think if we're finding, like, okay, I've learned some things about communication, whatever, some meta tools, and I'm still finding that I can't show up as myself because the other person kind of won't make room for that, then that's maybe a moment where we reassess.
Yeah, that's interesting. I did jot a note to myself. I was like, what if the two people are just in completely different spaces in terms of willing to grapple with self-growth and self-awareness? And I do think sometimes what can happen is one partner is like, oh, I just need to try harder. I just need to go to therapy. I just need to learn more tools, and ends up kind of just putting all of the responsibility on themselves. And I think there is, yeah, I think you named it, that it really does take two people who are kind of willing to show up, instead of just one person who's like, can learn more tools, I can become like more enlightened. So I want to circle back to the unmet needs piece. I think that's really important. And I do think we're going to get back to my questions here. Because the question that is making me think of is I saw a meme just the other day, and it was something about like capitalism running on manufactured exhaustion. And so the question that I had asked you to speak to is, can we talk about the ways in which capitalism creates and perpetuates relationship challenges and relationship dysfunction? I actually wrote relational fuckery. And what we can do about that. And I think what I'm also thinking about now is like, it's really scary when we identify our unmet needs and we are in a circumstance where it's actually really challenging to meet those needs, either ourselves or asking our partner to do it, because everyone is just so tapped out and exhausted and running on fumes or on like this energy deficit.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of my favorite topics. It's sort of something I think about every single day. Yeah, it's a little bit hard for me to even imagine a worse approach to organizing human life than what we're currently doing. Things like manufactured scarcity and exhaustion, things like always putting human beings in this like unnecessary competition for resources, understandably triggers people's like worst fight or flight responses. And we're doing that every day. And that's a very, very hard state from which to like access enough insight and distance from your trauma and distance from your nervous system's reaction to, you know, all the things, lack of time, lack of resources. That's a really hard place to do honest, thoughtful, open communication from, right? Because we're just so caught in the cycle of feeling like my needs are just constantly unmet, you know? And this is where then we can get really quick to assign blame to a partner, because monogamy conveniently sets us up for this expectation that like, you're my person, you're going to meet all the needs, but I'm exhausted, so it's your fault, you know? And this has really become where I've just gotten so clear with myself that relationship has to be about community, not about just one particular relationship. Because it, you know, my relationships are my mutual aid network. Like that's how I plan to survive late capitalism.
Yeah, it's amazing how a friend or neighbor or coworker or family member or other partner, you name it, bringing over extra soup that they made can stave off a fight between people who live together. Because when needs aren't met, I think Erin's correctly identifying that we tend to point at the person who we rely on the most, even though we know that they're also exhausted. And then the fights become about, well, you don't make enough money, or you touched on this a little, I think, Celestyna, of like, you're not doing enough work, growth and emotional work. So my unmet need of emotional insecurity is actually your fault. And it's so easy. And this is where, you know, we put a disclaimer kind of on everything that we talk about, where you can go out and acquire tools, and you should. We encourage people to do that. Everything can be weaponized, right? So when you have unmet needs, sometimes people are fighting about, well, I'm listening to all the right podcasts and reading all the right books, and you're not. And at that point, the self-growth becomes about one-upmanship. And that's another thing that capitalism really encourages. All right, like mostly in the work setting, but we're always in a one-up mindset because we're competing for scarce resources. We're competing for that promotion. We're competing for a bonus. We're competing with other house buyers if we can afford a house at all. You know, I used to live in the DC area, and I had a friend who put an offer on a house 50,000 over asking, and he said they didn't even write us back because someone else had offered 200,000 over asking. Like, that is the world that we're living in. And I think that capitalism just kind of encourages us to constantly be wanting more. And that creates this sense of scarcity where we always have unmet needs because capitalism tells us we don't have everything that we need. And it's the constant, like the fish outgrows you outgrow the fish tank, then you need a bigger fish tank, and then you need a bigger fish tank and a nicer car, a bigger house, you name it. Capitalism is constantly kind of fanning the flames of conflict between people because we always feel like we don't have what we need.
I also feel like it just really robs people of time, and it feels like relationships just like that's a resource that relationships need is just time. Even having a conversation that is like slow enough and, like de-escalated enough, it takes like twice as long to really like take in what the other person is saying and to really like pause before you respond. So I hear what you're saying, and I'm feeling like something come up in me, which is like, oh, like now you're asking me to like build community when like I don't even have the skills to be in like a monogamous relationship. Like, and it is feeling like, again, like overwhelming, like I think one of the things that people struggle with is this gap between what they know, like I should be working towards, and like how to get there. And so I think this brings me to another one of my questions, which is if we want to be building all different kinds of relationships, not just like romantic monogamous relationships, like if we do kind of want a network and a community and like redundancy in our relationships and diversity in our relationships, and if kind of conflict and discomfort and stickiness is part of like enduring and deepening relationships, what do you think is low-hanging fruit around skills that people can acquire to make conflict more generative or just more tolerable, or like what are the things people need to do to begin to build relationships in a way where they can start getting their needs met?
Yeah, I know when you sent us this question, we both had thoughts on it. I actually, in this moment with where we're going, I want to actually skip to one of our other answers where we just worked with some clients, and based on the conflict that they were dealing with, came up with this tool for them that I bring it up now because ideally they were going to use the communication tool with each other, but we encourage them in between sessions as homework, try it in another setting that's lower stakes before you try it with each other. And they both ended up using it in a work setting, with one with a colleague who he wasn't the direct supervisor, and the other during a performance review of someone he supervises. And they both said, this went great. And it's very, very simple. It's such low-hanging fruit. And it's simply that, like, when we have needs, the temptation is to make demands. That's when we feel insecure. It's like, I need this from you. So the first step that we tell people is we remind them that everything between adults is a request. So don't make demands, make requests. And you can't just put a question mark on something and label it a request. It does need to be open. You need to be a safe person to say no to. But the thing that was missing for these folks was they were making requests of each other, but the requests felt like they had expectations attached to them, and neither one of them was feeling understood. And the simple low-hanging fruit answer was, when you make a request, follow it up with a question so that you invite the other person to collaborate with you on meeting the request. So instead of just saying, hey, can you do this for me? You say, hey, can you do this for me? And what challenges might come up for you in meeting this request that I'm making? Or what do I need to understand about your situation as I make this request? Being curious instead of just simply like, hey, I need you to do this for me, is really low-hanging fruit. And it applies across all sorts of relationships, familial, professional, romantic, friends. We're constantly making requests of each other, whether they're direct or not. And if you can make a request and then inquire of the other person how it's going to be for them to address that request, now you're in conversation with each other instead of transactional request, meet my request situations.
Erin, do you have stuff to add, or that made me think of something, but.
Yeah, I think like really the main thing I want to add, and it's hard to do in a moment where you're really feeling escalated, but before you actually open your mouth and step toward another person to make a request or say something to them, honestly, just having some practice of checking in with your own nervous system and doing like a moment of just care for yourself so that you're coming from, you know, the least escalated place possible in the moment. I'm certainly not going to say like you have to be fully calm and grounded to even approach conflict, because that's just not realistic, especially as you had talked about with limitations of time. But yeah, turning inward first to just recheck, like, okay, what version of me is showing up to this conversation right now? Am I in tune with the things that matter most to me? Yeah, it's taking that moment to self-reflect before stepping towards somebody.
Yeah, I love that. I do similar work with my parents where building that consciousness, like you can check your escalation a lot earlier. Like a lot of people only become aware they're escalated when they're like already completely over the falls. And so just, yeah, being able to be like, oh, yeah, okay, like I'm feeling a little bit tighter right now. And yeah, I think that awareness is really helpful and really beautiful. And it's also really wild how I think that's another really basic skill that so many of us are missing, is just like that internal reflection of like what affect we have at any given moment in time. Yeah, that was really helpful. I think I just want to reflect back this idea of like curiosity being so such low-hanging fruit, and it's so helpful just to be like, huh, like how is the other person right now? How am I finding the other person? And same, like, how am I right now? Like, how am I finding myself? Yeah, and I do also just want to name that this is what I was going to say is neurobiologically, the more escalated we are, the harder it is to be curious about like just our environment and someone else. And the more kind of myopic we get about just like a survival imperative. And then the more urgent like our own needs feel. And I think that's just another way that capitalism does everyone dirty, is because we are just kind of always at the edges of escalation. There's so much urgency and busyness and stuff that really does hook into like survival fears. Let's see. I guess let me ask about another question. In your work, is there something that currently feels like a new discovery or like a new technique or something that's really exciting that feels like, oh, like we've made it to the next level of like understanding like how conflict works or how relationship works, that just feels really exciting and fresh and like, oh, like I guess that's my
Yeah.
sorry, just kind of trailed off.
So probably a lot of what I've already said has been influenced by this amazing book that I'm reading. And it's a number of years old, Sarah Schulman's Conflict is Not Abuse. And it was very popular immediately in like restorative justice circles. And so I've been really interested in seeing how might this line of thinking apply not just to like community, restorative justice situations, but also to just like dyads, like relationships between two people. And the premise of the book is that kind of increasingly, especially in larger, like maybe more politicized circumstances, but it happens everywhere. There's this tendency to, in a way, overstate harm or the potential for harm, and to then turn that around and say, because I don't feel safe, which is different from actually being safe, right? Mm-hmm. But because I feel anxious, because I don't feel safe, that now gives me the right to punish, to, you know, subject someone else to actual harm. And like one of the quickest examples that might come to mind, and she certainly draws on it in the book, is like, you know, we've seen over the last 10 years with social media being present in social interactions that there's this real tendency for like a white person to show up, say at a public park, and see a group of Black people existing in public space and decide that they don't feel safe, and they make a phone call to the police, right? And at that moment, actual harm does come into the situation, but it's not toward the person who's calling the police, it's toward the people that the police are being called upon. And so it just sort of starts this like, well, I'm telling myself I'm unsafe. Now I get to be a victim, and victims have the right to, you know, to defend themselves. But it's actually what we would call, like, from the like understandings of domestic violence services, it's what we would call DARVO, right? Which is an acronym that stands for deny, attack, reverse, victim and offender. So it's kind of this way of putting oneself in a victim role so that you can attack and feel justified in that attack. And this is a very long-winded way of saying, like, a lot of it, like, I know I do this. We all do this. Sometimes we show up to a conflict with our entire backpack of lifelong trauma and previous conflicts, and we decide in that moment, like, well, I want everything to be addressed, even if this current moment only was one little piece of it, you know? So we kind of like to, at times, like, maybe take on a victim stance for all of our pain and expect that all of that pain is going to be recognized, heard, addressed, you know, made better. And that's just not, unfortunately, an approach that really works. It kind of tends to create more harm.
Yeah, and it's very informative and new for us. I think it's not, the concepts aren't new, but kind of the crystallization maybe is the part that's new, because this myth of self-defense comes up in all sorts of different ways. And one way that you typically see it in dyads or small groups is that someone does something that is generally, like, objectively not okay, like tells a lie or withholds information. And then the person who was lied to or kept out of the loop on something that directly impacts them reacts in a way that's like, this upsets me. And that's what gets grabbed onto. The person who lied says, well, the classic is like, well, see, this is why I can't tell you things, because you get upset. And that is harmful, because now you're actually essentially saying to the person, like, I'm allowed to do whatever I want. You can't get upset. Your feelings don't matter. Like, all of that gets communicated in this little interaction. And it's this myth of self-defense of like, well, I lied to you because I have to defend myself from you being upset with me not being nice to you. When you pick that apart logically, it's not hard to see that it's not healthy. And the way that we kind of shorthand that in a lot of our work is we just say the existence of pain does not equal the existence of blame. It's not linear. You're feeling pain, that's real, that's valid. That doesn't mean that you need to assign blame to someone else for that pain. Sometimes you do. Yeah, sometimes, you know, you got lied to, you feel upset. Yeah, like, that person lied to you. But a lot of times we feel pained by a situation and we're looking for who we're going to blame for it. And that's part of all of this that Erin's talking about. It's very ubiquitous.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, the question that I want to move into now is the way I asked it is, what are the most common patterns of conflict that you see? But I think I also want to expand it to be like, what are some common patterns of like dysfunction? And I think we're definitely talking about one now that you see in relationships. And what I want to fold in is just a wondering, like my kids are still pretty little. And they do this thing where like the house is just trashed. Like there's just toys all over the ground. There's been toys all over the ground for like days. And my kid will step on a Lego and his sister's name is P. He'll be like, P, why did you put that Lego there? Why are you trying to hurt me? And like the Lego's been there for 5 days and it's his Lego. And I just really see my kids like really wanting to blame something that's not themselves. And I wonder if it's like this archetypal human thing, because I don't think that they've picked that up necessarily from like other adults in their lives. And it does just seem like humans just want to externalize their pain because then it makes it easier. Like if you can pinpoint the problem, then like ostensibly there's like a solution. So I'm curious your thoughts there. And then sorry, this is a very long-winded question. The last thing that I wanted to say is this idea of like the perpetrator flip-flopping into the victim. And I myself have just noticed culturally, we have a lot of support and empathy for people who identify as victims, and we have almost no support and empathy for people who identify or are labeled as perpetrators. And I think about the fact that as humans, we can't help but commit harm at some point or another. As parents, we can't help but commit harm at some point or another. And if you have any thoughts or advice around how to like unshame the perpetrator part of us so we can carry it cleanly and have accountability for it. And that is like 5 questions in one. So how about it?
Beautiful. I love all of them.
Yeah.
I think I want to go with the last one first, in terms of the
Work
sort of,
backward.
yeah, we'll work backwards. So empathy for perpetrators, I think starts in recognizing, like you said, that that's going to be all of us at some point, and getting away from notions of there are good people who will not be perpetrators and there are bad people who will be, right? Because now, if I'm told I caused harm, there's an entire zip drive of shame that I'm now invited to. Are zip drives still used? I'm not a technology person. Okay, so there's a compressed file
of shame.
Shame lives.
I think that's going to be the title of this podcast episode. Sorry.
The zip drive of shame.
Yeah, the zip drive of shame. No, I'm just kidding. Continue. Sorry, I'm getting silly.
Yeah, and it's conveniently part of what supremacy culture teaches us is like you've got to strive to be perfect, and if you're not, you deserve to open your zip drive of shame and really struggle forever and ever. And I think that what I get excited about in those moments of the labeling of victim and perpetrator and all of that is to just allow my brain a moment to step outside of that construct and ask, like, what is the process of interaction that is going on here or can go on here, so that we can loosen up our identification with either victim or perpetrator and move into a shared process where those identity points don't need to be fixed and kind of don't necessarily need to be super present at all. Like when Mike talks about mediation, it's really about understanding that the problem exists outside of the individuals and that the individuals are there to collaborate in addressing the problem. But what usually happens is that we point at each other and say, you're the problem, right? Like you're the perpetrator. So yeah, I think that's kind of where I'm at with it, is like, we need better cultural models about how we show up to conflict that don't always rely on victim perpetrator.
Which is like
Yeah,
basically the whole legal justice system. So that's problematic.
for sure.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a very punitive system, and even reward, like the promise of reward or the giving of rewards for good behavior is also problematic when you look at a restorative justice model and what it's trying to do instead, because rewards are just basically the flip side of the reward is you don't deserve the reward, therefore open up your zip drive of shame. So that can be really harmful as well. But I really like Erin's point here of separating out like a good person versus good approach or good behavior, a bad person from bad approach or bad behavior. And I just want to be really clear also, like, there is certainly acute abuse and acute trauma, and no one needs to sit down with someone who harmed them if they don't want to. People need to heal the way that they need to. And I think I'll speak for myself here, but like, I've been in a situation where someone harmed me and then said they were going to do the work to address the patterns behind that behavior. And my response was like, that's great. I can't be there for that. So that's a very valid option as well. Even when someone acknowledges harm and says, I'm going to fix this, quote unquote, you don't have to be there for that if your healing requires you to not interact with that person. Well, that's just a little disclaimer. But I think the key for me is when you separate out, you're not labeling someone a bad person. You're saying they did a harmful thing. Now you can look at whether that person has willingness to change. And if you are experiencing, if the behavior is addressed, if the harm is addressed and the person chooses to continue to behave in that way, knowing that it's harmful, now you can say, this is a pattern that I don't want to be available for. But if it's something that's, even something like lying to someone, context is important here, but if someone lies to you and you immediately label them, you're a bad person, and I'm never gonna be available for repair with you, that's a really like extreme version, and it can actually be harmful to the perpetrator that they don't get a chance to repair ever. And again, like context and severity matters here, and I can't say that enough, but I think if we could get away from saying there are bad people and good people, conflict would be a lot easier for everyone to address, because then that's part of not looking at the other person as the problem, but looking at the behavior, what led to the behavior, unmet needs. That's something that can be collaborated on while addressing the harm and the need for healing and repair.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. So a lot of my parents are like really afraid that their kids are going to grow up to be like homeless, vagrant, like criminals. Just what the human brain does. It goes to this worst case scenario. And also, I can't help but think of, like you mentioned, a lot of our religious and cultural kind of presuppositions are that humans are like inherently bad and we have to like actively work towards goodness at all times. Otherwise, the glide path is just into like total like mutiny and apathy and like which I find just super incorrect and also really harmful. And I think it's there just like in our deep unconscious because it's in like the collective waters that we swim in. So I really appreciate just this invitation to be like, like maybe there's like an inherent like goodness or like orientation in all humans. And if we just let people be, like they're not all going to turn into like lazy, freeloading like criminals. Like they'll find their own way in life according to their own like inner map and inner wisdom. I wanted to ask about something. This is my own parenting experience, but I know a lot of parents have this experience as well. Speaking of like relationships that are intense, because parent-child relationship is one that's really hard to get out of, and also one that kicks up a lot of developmental trauma. This sense that like you've done something wrong, you want to repair, like you go to repair and you want to do better, but for whatever reason, you can't. And what I'm thinking of, just to ground it into something specific, is like a parent who yells. They don't want to yell. They want to stop yelling, but it's something that feels like really compulsive in their system, or they like, you know, there's just a point, speaking of the zip drive of shame, where a parent has done something that they regret enough times, apologized for it enough times, like tried to change it enough times. And then that sense of like helplessness of like, I actually don't know how to get out of this pattern, unlocks so much shame that it actually like helps to even drive that pattern more, you know, like, because there's just so much pain whenever you find yourself in approaching that pattern or actively in that pattern. So I don't know if you could just speak to that. Like, does
Yeah,
that make sense as a question?
it really makes so much sense and is very, very personally relevant to me. This is a place, I mean, God, it's such a big scenario you're bringing, and so important. I think this is a place where, like, a lot of times you're mentioning the parent-childhood relation, or
I
the parent-child
know. Yeah, yeah.
relationship as the locus of like what's kind of generating that response, right? The yelling. And my sense of it is, this is kind of off the dome, but my sense of it is that is probably not going to be the location where you can immediately do the healing. I feel like as a parent, if my response to stress and conflict is to yell, probably what I'm going to need is to step outside of the parent-child relationship to look for support and in some way feel understood as the person who is yelling, like, why am I yelling and why can't I stop? Find whether it's, you know, a therapist or good friends or family members or someone else who has a similar patterning, where we can get understanding, so that because like you said, I do think it's the zip drive of shame that is driving a lot of these behaviors and keeping us locked in them. And so if we can, you know, first acknowledge it, that is required, like the accountability piece does have to be there. But then hopefully what the accountability gives you is a sense like, okay, this is real for me. I do need support around it. I can get out of my shame enough to feel like I deserve support around it. And like the hope is that we can be seen enough in our really ugly shit and be told, like, this doesn't mean that you're done as a person or done as a parent. Yeah, I feel like, woo, this is bringing up a lot for me. I think that that is what allows us to step back into the really difficult areas, and feel like at least we can show up for it and try some more.
Yeah.
Your question is so good, Celestina, because that relationship is so unique. And part of what I hear Erin touching on is, and I kind of touched on it earlier, is like sometimes healing needs to happen away from where the harm happened.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes that it's too raw for the healing to happen in that space. And so with a romantic partner or even a family member who's not a parent or child, you know, there are all sorts of relationships where we can step away and come back. You know, how many people do you know are like, oh, I didn't talk to my parents for 3 years when I was in my 20s, and now we have a great relationship. There's all sorts of examples where people were able to step away. But when it's a parent child and it's truly a child who's, you know, I'm talking about under 18, they're not an adult, they are still in your household, they're a dependent, you can't really step away from that. not in the way that you can with other relationships. And so Erin's points about finding support elsewhere so that you can come back is really important. But you're also, it's so unique because you're having to still exist in that space at the same time. And that is one of the hardest conflicts I think out there is when you have a parent-child conflict and the parent is doing their best, they're being accountable for behaviors that are tough, and you can't necessarily ask that of the kid. You can't ask the kid to meet you at that same space, and especially like teenagers are in a developmental phase where they're supposed to be narcissistic, they're supposed to, you know, be self-absorbed. And I think, yeah, you have to find the support elsewhere. Figuring out how to exist while the harm is still happening and having the healing happen at the same time is one of the hardest things that we have to do.
Yeah. And I also just really want to say out loud, as a culture, we just have to do so much better by parents. Like,
Yeah.
need so much more.
Yeah, we expect perfection of parents
with no resources.
with no resources.
Yeah, and it's just not tenable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is just a great place to just name like how difficult it is what we're working with. Like we are just a culture, like in some ways, not just driven by trauma, but shaped by trauma. And it is like now we are really trying to, like, everyone is drowning in the ocean and we're all trying to save ourselves. So like any type of parenting work or relationship work is just, it is really hard. And I think one of the things that I didn't name in that question, but I think what I was trying to get at is like, if I fuck up more times than the cultural template allows for, like, are you still going to love me? Do I still get to keep trying? You know, like, are my efforts still meaningful? And like, is there progress? Like, even if I feel like there's just been a repeated like trail of failures, like, do I still get to try, and is there meaning in that? And I think that for many humans, that's like speaking of unnamed or unmet, like needs or reassurances. Again, not necessarily a question, but a reflection. Go ahead.
Yeah, God, this is meaningful. I think that's honestly where, like what immediately popped into my mind, Mike, was the tool that you brought up of like making a request and also asking for the other person's experience around that request. So like maybe the request, you know, not in the middle of the storm, but as it's passed, like, maybe the request is like, can I show up to try again to face this conflict without getting to the point of yelling? And I acknowledge kiddo or partner, whoever it was that was receiving that angry version of me, like, I really am hopeful that you're going to grant me the opportunity to show up and do better. And I want to know so that I am not bypassing the harm and not bypassing your experience. I want to know what you will need to enable me to show up and try again.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah. And this is where like we say, like, you know, conflict is everywhere, right? Like we don't have this business trying to serve people and improve their communication and relationships with conflict being a thing that doesn't happen that often. It happens all the time. And sometimes, you know, when we try to normalize it, we'll offer as an example to people like, do you like pineapple on your pizza and your roommate doesn't, and you're ordering a pizza? You're in conflict. Like that's a very low stakes example, but we're trying to show people like conflict happens all the time. And what matters is approach, and you can practice approach in low stakes situations. That's the best place to practice. But let's not ignore the fact that some conflict is super high stakes, super emotional. It's going to open up the backpack of trauma, which has the potential to open the zip drive of shame. And if you can have these tools handy, we like to say, and we have on our website this Bruce Lee quote of like, when you're under duress, you fall to the level of your training. And a lot of us were not trained at all to handle conflict. And if you can have these tools, then even when it is a high stakes thing, approach matters. People read energy, people read intention. And especially if you're asking, can I have a chance to try again? And you're wanting to be curious about what the other person needs for that to feel safe for them. Sometimes that is the best that we can do. Conflict is hard. You know, if it was easy, we wouldn't be doing this. So I think, I don't know, this just seems like such a good, like, this question that you asked is hitting on everything that's important about what we do. So thank you.
Yeah, well, I feel like it was a deep question. And speaking of like this metaphor of everyone drowning in an ocean trying to save themselves, I do kind of want to talk about, okay, so you mentioned like training, like, okay, so is there like conflict training that people can do, or like this idea of like your approach to conflict really matters? Okay, so like what do people need to know about how they approach conflict? Just maybe some like tools and strategies that people can kind of begin to work with to feel like, oh yeah, like I do have agency around like improving my experience here. That would be really helpful. I feel like there was something else I wanted to say, but yeah, let's just do that. Like,
Okay.
let's give me something like positive that like I can stick in someone's hand.
Yeah, absolutely. We're each gonna share one if that's okay. We were just having like a little side chat, like which one?
Which of the tools out of the toolbox?
Yeah. And actually one of them is a little bit just like an identification tool, in terms of like identifying what kind of what kind of approach to conflict am I taking? And this actually comes from like class number 1 in our course on collaborative conflict. And it's possibly something that you or people listening have heard of before if they're familiar at all with Buddhist philosophy. So Buddhist philosophy kind of states, they name the 3 poisons, which are attachment, aversion or avoidance, and ignorance. And it's honestly been like, I'm no Buddhist scholar by any stretch of the imagination, but just applying the categorization of the 3 poisons to conflict has been so helpful for me, because I start to see like, okay, the way I'm approaching this uncomfortable moment feels like it falls into avoidance, or feels like it falls into attachment, which often attachment often shows up in like the yelling. It shows up in not being able to hear another person's perspective because we're so attached to our own story or whatever. Ignorance is often an element in conflict when we don't have the same shared information to work from. Like, I'm pissed that you don't go to the grocery store like you said you would, and it's because I don't have the information that you got an emergency phone call, when you were supposed to be going to the store. So kind of just pausing to ask like, all right, which of the poisons am I drinking right now? And do I have another choice?
Yeah.
Other.
The other one, identifying is so important. And then when you this tool that I'm going to talk about is more for like when you're in conflict or you're about to be in conflict. And we call it mirror and get clearer. It pulls on tenets of nonviolent communication, imago therapies, mediation tactics. And it's easy to remember because it rhymes, and it's simple to do. It's not difficult to do, but it's simple. The first thing that you do, it's really focused on the idea that when we listen, we need to try to listen to understand rather than listen to respond. And so the mirror part is you ask someone what their experience was, and after they talk, you literally mirror it back to them. And the key there is you don't add your own words, you don't add your own interpretation. You don't add your own sarcastic intonation to it. So if Erin were to say, taking on her example, like, I'm really mad that you didn't go to the grocery store, like you said you would, you literally just mirror it back. I'm hearing, or it sounds like, or if I'm understanding you correctly, ... You're mad that I said I was going to go to the grocery store and I didn't. And you stop. And the next part, the get clearer part, is just asking a question. So as you mirror, you say, sounds like you're mad that I didn't go to the grocery store when I said I would. The kind of little wrinkle to that also that I should mention is, then you say, did I get that right? Because this is a really simple example, but often people are like, this and this and this and this and this. You reflect back to them, you say, is that right? And did I miss anything? And when you do that, it helps the other person. It's actually disarming because it forces them to focus on what they're actually pissed about. And it hones in on like, okay, here's the issue. So maybe the issue is more about, I said I was going to do something and I didn't. It's not about the fact that we don't have milk in the fridge. It's, I said I was going to do something and I didn't. The get clearer part then is you ask a follow-up question. And that follow-up question is context dependent, but it could be like, hey, is this, what do I need to understand about like how you're feeling right now? And that could be like, well, when you don't do what you said you're going to do, I feel like I can't trust you. And now you're getting at the like really deep issue underneath. And so that's a really simple example, but this tool, anyone can do it. Mirror. So you reflect back what the person said. Is that accurate? And did I miss anything? And you iterate. If they say, no, that's not what I said. Okay, can you say it again so I make sure I got it? And then you carve away the stuff that doesn't matter until you get to the meat of it. And then you ask a question. It gets back to the curiosity piece, but that's a thing that anyone can do. It's hard to do when you're escalated. But if you can just remember in your mind, mirror and get clearer, it's disarming in the best kind of way. Because instead of getting defensive, what you're ultimately doing is showing the other person that you care that they're upset and you want to know why.
Yeah, I like the iteration piece and the asking, like, did I get that right? Like, what part of that did I get wrong? And what else do I want to say? Sorry, my brain is like a little bit broken right now.
That's okay.
It feels like we're wrapping up. It does feel like there's stuff that, I guess the one piece that this happened very early on in the conversation, but it feels like I would appreciate to drill into it a little bit more, is this piece of like weaponizing anything, especially like your own like self-growth or self-awareness like process, or like I personally felt really called out by that one, which I think is why I want to circle back to it. So this could be fun. We could get into my shit just here at the very end. But I feel like that is something that happens like with me and my partner a lot, where he'll be like, like, no, I like playing the victim, or like, I really do identify with the victim in this case. And I'm just like, so like, you don't want to do like any sort of work around that? And he'll just be like, nope. And I'll be like, well, like, I clearly am like on the better path here, because like I am the type of person who would want to do work around that. And like, and so that's a place where like I personally end up feeling stuck. And like, just to be really transparent, like some of the thoughts that come up for me are like, oh, like, do I want to be in a relationship with this person? Like, are we just going to continue to grow apart in this particular area of our lives? Like, or like, oh, like, fuck, like, what do I do with that? Like that was a super unhelpful answer. Now what?
Honestly, the first thing that comes to my mind is a curiosity around there must be something that the identification with being a victim is providing him. And I'm curious what that is. And just because I'm not part of the relationship, I'm like, I don't have any judgment around it. I don't need him to change it or fix it. I'm just like, I wonder what that's like. There's something there that feels, I don't know, helpful for him or productive in some way, to keep that identity. And so I just want to know what is it doing for you? Like, yeah.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think again, it's the curiosity piece. And instead of being like, well, oh, this is stuck, you said no. And this is like some inside mediation talk, but like, no isn't the end of a conversation. No is an opportunity to ask a question and clarify. It happens in mediation all the time. Someone says they want something, the other person says no. And that's generally, people are in positions like, I want spousal support. You're not getting spousal support. Okay, they said no. Can you explain to me more about what spousal support does for you? What the promise of, is it? And you might find out it's about fear of financial insecurity. You might find out that actually they need more time to detach from this person, and getting a check every month will help them wean off of the relationship. It could be anything. Being curious about it is where you're going to get information that potentially helps you find common ground and mutual benefit. And so I would do the same thing that Erin said. The question that came to my mind was, how is being in this role serving you? So whether it's what are you getting from it? How is it making you feel better? How is it making you feel safe? It's when someone says no, it's question time. Yeah.
That's another helpful strategy, I feel like, for people to just kind of think about, like, oh, okay. And just to unfold that a little bit, when you hear like what feels like a definitive no, the types of questions that you want to ask to reopen the conversation again, but not like ignore that person's boundary, I think. Like, do you have some like tips
For sure.
or advice around like, okay, what's the next question to ask when you hear what feels just like a total like one word answer that's just a no?
Yeah, I think this really starts to come down to the intention behind your question. Like, why are you asking them a question after you hear a no?
Mhm.
And if your intention is to get them to change their minds, you are crossing a boundary. If your intention is to better understand them, then that's a really different energy. That's a really different sense of what's going on in the conversation. And they have the right to say, I don't actually want to talk about why I'm saying no anymore. I want my no to be a complete sentence. And, then we have to take our curiosity somewhere else, at least for the time being.
Yeah, I think you're hitting it on the head. When the goal is to convince someone or change their position, now that question is combative. When the goal is to understand better, now the question is collaborative. And just to make it a little more practical, to give people a tool, if someone were to say no, period, and we can continue with your example, Celestyna, of just like, hey, do you want to do work around the fact that you like to play the victim? No. One question that you can ask is, okay, like you can start by saying, it sounds like the idea of like my suggestion made you feel unsafe and you said no. Can you explain to me an alternative that might make you feel safe? Or can you explain to me what staying in what you're doing, can you explain to me how that makes you feel safe? I'd like to know what makes you feel safe. And so that way you're inviting them to stay where they are. You're inviting them to generate an alternative for themselves without you telling them what that is. You can do either, you can do both, but you're not trying to convince them to move or change their position. You're saying to them, I would like to understand what makes you feel safe. And if people don't want to engage with that, that's good information. Like if people don't want to, in any context, if you're approaching it out of curiosity and a concern for what makes them feel safe, and they don't want to engage with you, then that's information for you, and maybe you can take your curiosity somewhere else. Maybe you decide that that's a boundary for you, that conversation can't happen. But Erin's right that the key is really like, convince. A question to convince is combative. A question out of curiosity is collaborative. That's a lot of C words, and it's alliterative, so maybe that helps. But I think that is the key. I agree.
Well, and I think people can really like non-verbally sense the energetics of your motivation behind like pushing beyond a no. So I think it's also important just to slide in, like, you're not gonna fool anyone if like you're asking what sounds like a collaborative question and it actually is with the intent to like gather information to convince. So it really does have to come from like a true internal shift. Ask me how I know. I'm just kidding. Yeah, well, and I think this is a good place to kind of begin to wrap. I think this idea of safety, like I really do like the question that you gave there, because I think whether or not we feel safe really is like such an underpinning thing in like a lot of relationship stuff. And that can be a great practice to just begin to kind of orient, I think, Erin, it was you earlier in the conversation was like, do I just feel unsafe or am I really unsafe? And I've had a mentor kind of offer this question, which I found really helpful, which is like, am I actually unsafe or am I just uncomfortable? So beginning to do the work like in relationship and with yourself around like safety. And I've actually like this, not to just go off, but I just want to give people another practice that I've found really fun and transformative, which is just to take a small amount of time of like, like 3 days or like a week, and just have this practice of like prioritizing my safety and just like always just like really actively tracking like how safe do I feel in this moment, what's making me feel unsafe, and just coming into a better, it really is a relationship with your nervous system, but like this concept of safety, understanding how important it is to people, and again how unconscious we are around it.
That's really cool.
So I was sorry, that was like a lot. I was like, oh yeah, safety. Let's talk about it.
It's a super cool exercise. I'm kind of interested in trying it.
Yeah, it did shift a lot for me. And which is why like I had to throw it in there, because it was profound enough that I was like, oh yeah, this was really helpful. And ultimately it did result in me feeling safer moving forward. So
that's great.
Feeling unsafe is a big thing for me. I think for everyone, honestly, but
for sure.
Well, cool. Do you guys want to add to anything I just blurted out, or is there anything else that you feel like we need to kind of complete really fast, or like any loose threads or anything else?
Nothing comes to mind that's like, oh, we need to close the loop on this. Yeah,
I think this conversation has been really, it's been so nice to be able to talk about what we do in a balanced way of like, here's why we do it, here's kind of some of the theory behind it, and here's also some practical tools of that we get taught to color in between the lines, but no one teaches us how to have an argument, and we really want to be able to give people some tools. So thank you for weaving seamlessly between what's behind what we do and then what is it that we do and how can it be helpful for people. I feel really good about the conversation.
Cool. Okay. Well, that's it for now. There might be more conversations in the future. As we close, tell people about how they can work with you, what you have coming up, all the things, all the ways that people can reach you and experience you.
great. Yeah. So our website is pomegranatecoachingandmediation.com. We can send all the links and stuff to you.
Sorry, there's no and. It's Pomegranate Coaching Mediation.
Thank you. Yeah.
We'll put everything you guys say, we'll put in the show notes, just FYI for people listening, and also so you don't feel like you have to spell everything out.
Okay,
fantastic. Great. Thank you. And coming up, actually, the first thing coming is a workshop that we've created specifically for people in polyamorous relationships. It's a workshop called Creating Healthy Metamor Relationships. So your metamor is your partner's other partner. And those can be relationships that have some unique challenges and conflicts. So that's coming up next month, June 26th.
June 23rd.
23rd, thank you, detail guy. And then
Wait, can I
our flagship.
interrupt you? Sorry. That almost feels like a similar relationship to like what a co-parent might have with their partner's new partner.
Yes,
Am I reading that right?
absolutely.
So
I
like,
would
could
say,
this be a helpful thing for people to take that are in like co-parenting relationships and not polyamorous relationships? Because like, it feels helpful.
yeah, you know,
Or like,
I
I just had that
yes,
idea, but because like, again,
no,
just reflecting on my own personal, I'm like, yeah, like I have a partner who has a co-parent, and we actually don't have friction in real life because we never talk, but we certainly have friction like in my dreams and in my thoughts. So
yeah. So what I'll say about the workshop is there's a lot of context that's very specific to the polyamorous metamor relationship. The exercises, though, that we will take people through to address the conflicts that come up certainly would apply to the co-parenting situation. Yeah, I think that's a really brilliant link that you've made.
Yeah, it is. We spend some time in the workshop going over different non-monogamous relationship structures so that people can kind of understand where they're at and what they might want and reflect on that. But ultimately, yes, that relationship of kind of, it's essentially the metamors are currently in partnership with the same person, and the co-parenting situation you described is just a different timing or timeline.
Mhm.
But yeah, having to interact or not with someone who is very influential in your life is similar in principle for sure.
Yeah. So if there are folks who kind of want the approaches and the exercises, but they need help translating the information into the co-parenting scenario, they can reach out. I'd be happy to like do a little translation conversation with them.
Yeah. And the best way to reach us for inquiries like that is through the website. We have a simple button to book a consult with us. We do free 15-minute consultations to see how we can help people talk about briefly like what their issue is and kind of guide them into the services that we could provide. So we're always open for personalized coaching or mediation if that's where you're at. But then we have this Metamor workshop on June 23rd, and then our flagship introductory course, Introduction to Collaborative Conflict, starts in August. And we actually have 2 free preview talks for folks if they're interested. It's a full like hour, 15-minute. We'll show you what we cover in the 6-week course. Those are on June 25th and July 23rd. And we have some other stuff coming down the pipe as well that we can send you to put in the show notes. But ultimately, yeah, the best thing for people to do is like we're a small business. It's the 2 of us. We provide all the service ourselves. And we talk directly to people who are curious about how we can help them. So booking a consult with us is really the best way that we can guide people towards how we can help.
okay, awesome. We will have all of that in the show notes. That's all very exciting. I'm very excited by my discovery of like, oh, a metamor relationship is not unlike like a co-parenting like situation. So
oh my God, so similar.
I'm sorry, by the way, for like relating everything we talked about to parenting. That's just like my brain is like pattern.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
what an amazing conversation. I think this is going to be super helpful for people to hear. Thank you so much for chatting with me. Yeah, this is great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Thanks for a great conversation.
Yeah.